Welcome to the Orlando Sentinel Editorial Board interview for State House District 42, an Orlando-based seat that is held by Representative Anna Eskamani, first elected in 2018 and easily reelected since, though this will be her final term in the House due to term limits. Her Republican opponent, real estate broker Gregory Paul, is not going to be joining us. So we will be spending time with Representative Eskamani, going over some of her priorities for the state. And we'll start with an issue that is something that is a priority every year because it's the only real duty that legislators have, and that's writing the budget. And as you know, Florida's had 3+ years of record spending thanks to all the federal cash that came down during the pandemic. Over the next 2 years, that's going to be drying up. So we know that state economist Amy Baker has said that Florida could go from a $2 billion surplus to a $2.9 billion shortfall if spending continues at the current level. What should legislators do in 2025 to deal with that reality?
Well, thank you so much for having me and for the great question. Our one constitutional responsibility is to pass what's called a balanced budget. But as you noted, that budget is balanced with the help of the federal government alongside tax revenue from use tax and, of course, trust funds. And right now, Florida's budget is upwards of $117 billion. And candidly, when it comes to paying for some of our needs, whether it's funding for public education, whether it is responding to different social safety nets, we're not making the cut. In fact, Florida continues to have high demands in these arenas while not meeting the needs of everyday Floridians. So we already are seeing the deficits in our budget. It doesn't always show up on the balance sheet, but it does show up in the lack of infrastructure we have. It shows up in the delay that Floridians face when trying to access things like SNAP or unemployment compensation, alongside the ability to retain teachers. So what do we do about it? Of course, there are very valid conversations regarding the potential of new tax revenue through the Recreational Cannabis Ballot Initiative Amendment 3. So I do think that should be something that we are ready for and prepared for, because it will generate, assuming it passes, billions of dollars in additional revenue. But I'm also, as the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, really committed to closing corporate tax loopholes to ensure that everyone pays what they owe and that we're not balancing the budget on the backs of everyday working people. And so what does that mean? Well, one of the policies that I've championed is called combined reporting. And it would basically ensure that multi-state international corporations can't hide their revenue streams in Florida to avoid their tax liability. And some economists have estimated this is costing the state upwards of $1 billion a year. And so pursuing combined reporting, which more than half the union in this country has already done, is always going to be one of my priorities, because again, it not only is just the ethical right thing to do, but it also makes the market more competitive for our smaller state-based businesses who can't compete with some of these Goliaths that have an army of lobbyists and accountants that can fudge numbers and move over their revenue to other states like Delaware, where they're able to not meet up to their obligations here in the state of Florida. With that said, there's always the need to look at the budget with a fine-tooth comb. I mean, for example, Governor Ron DeSantis has wasted money on frivolous lawsuits. He's spending public money right now on his anti-abortion campaign, upwards of $700 an hour for attorneys. And we've also seen him use public money to traffic asylum seekers. So there's a lot of other steps we can take to also just pull down on the frivolous spending.
Well, I wanted to follow up with that to address something that some people regard at times as frivolous spending, which is that for decades, the state funding has been used to support local priorities. Some of them very big deals like septic to sewer projects, mental health programs, or very famously in the last year, arts and culture opportunities. And Governor Ron DeSantis did veto the entirety of that budget this year. Do you think that the state should help with these local projects? And do you think that the process that Florida uses to evaluate these local projects is being fairly followed?
Another great question. I want to start off with just stressing how arts and culture has always played a very big role in my life. I was a high school theater kid. And when my mom passed away when I was 13 years old, high school theater really became my safe space so that I could stay focused in school and get to college and now have a PhD in public administration. So I owe so much to arts and culture as being a foundation in my life. And I'm proud to serve on many arts and culture nonprofit boards right here in Central Florida. To the heart of your question, the reason why these investments are important is the ROI. We know that when it comes to arts and culture funding, that every dollar we put in, we get $9 back in economic generation. But with that said, these projects are adding so much to our communities and helping kids like me pursue long-term success. Governor DeSantis vetoing these projects was very political. And he, of course, made comments trying to politicize arts and culture in ways that even members of his own Republican Party, people that I serve with, people that I serve, oppose his position in doing that. With that said, we have to remember that tax generation in Florida is coming from the locals. We're predominantly reliant on sales tax. We have a very low corporate income tax in Florida, and we don't have an income tax. And that's why people love moving to Florida. So sales tax is that foundational source of revenue, and it's predominantly coming from big counties like ours. So of course the state government should help fulfill the needs of local projects because it's our infrastructure that's helping to keep the state's budget balanced. And so when I look at the landscape of where money comes from in Florida, it's going to be the big heavy hitters like Orange County that contribute to the most. And we're also subsidizing the more rural, fiscally constrained counties and their ability to make ends meet within their communities, which I think is one of the beautiful parts of Florida, is that we're so diverse and we step up to help one another on a good day and after tragedy. But it also means that the legislature has a responsibility to bring those dollars back to our communities, which is why I fight so hard in the budget to make sure that UCF is funded, that we're funding, of course, our teachers, and that we are supporting these local projects, whether it's water projects or arts and culture projects.
Thank you for that. Switching to medical care. Florida still has a large number of people who lack healthcare access. Do you see a path for Florida to expand Medicaid to cover low-income working families? And what other strategies would you consider to be most effective? I know Title 21 program expansion has been talked about, or that or others, if you could talk about those.
For sure. I mean, I have been a longtime advocate for Medicaid expansion from my college days. I remember when the Affordable Care Act was signed into law, and we fought during the first legislative session to expand Medicaid, accept these federal dollars. And of course, now a decade later, I mean, it still continues to be this fight that we're having in our state. The path right now, when it comes to implementing Medicaid expansion for all Floridians, really is going to come from the ballot box. There is an organization called Florida Decides Healthcare that is working to collect the number of signatures needed for this to be on the 2026 ballot. And at this point, with the current makeup of the legislature, though we are finally seeing some bipartisan support for Medicaid expansion, including from Representative Redmond, one of my Republican colleagues in North Florida, it's still not enough for this legislation to actually pass. And so that is a major crisis in our state. Some stats say that 1 in 4 Floridians don't have access to healthcare because of insurance. When it comes to where we rank on women's health, Florida continues to rank at the bottom. And most of those indicators are connected to the lack of health insurance coverage. In my PhD program, I surveyed women in Paramore, and many of our community members in Paramore, these are moms who are delaying their own care to prioritize the care of their children. And of course, that's such a reflection of their values, but it also speaks to how they're not going to be able to take care of their children. They can't take care of themselves. That's a failure on the state of Florida because they're delaying care due to cost. So what else can we do about it? I think it's really, really important to invest in prevention. Our charity care providers, these are going to be organizations that can help address healthcare needs before they become chronic and more expensive. So the more money we can put into prevention, the better. Prevention saves lives and it saves on cost.
So you attempted to lead the change to file legislation that would give counties greater discretion in the use of tourist development taxes, but were stymied. What needs to happen to get that flexibility?
Well, one is that we need county commissioners that are going to be more committed to it. So the effort that we led in the legislature would have created a additional new tax called a tourism impact tax. And the intention of this was to create another option for a penny sales tax on top of the bed tax to go into affordable housing, which is something I do support. But candidly, my preference would just to create flexibility with the tourism development tax as it stands now, because creating a new tax is always challenging, as we saw when it comes to the transportation initiative for Orange County to create the additional penny for transit projects. And we already have this source of $350 million generated every year in Orange County with bonding power 3 times that we really can't touch. So it's important to have county commissioners that agree with those changes, because it will give us more ability to leverage those relationships in the state capitol. Ironically, many of my Republican colleagues actually agree with me. There have been many Republican bills throughout the years of my service that have made these small changes to the TDT to be used for infrastructure, for example. It's oftentimes my Democratic colleagues that are more hesitant to support this initiative. And so we really need to see a groundswell of everyday voters asking their representatives and senators to champion this issue. I'm really excited that Carlos Smith is going to be our next senator, because honestly, one of my roadblocks in getting this done was a senator from Orange County. And so I feel the tide is turning as these conversations continue, but also as the need presents itself. Here in Orange County, we continue to see homelessness skyrocket with very little option for shelter space. We have a huge need for public transportation, where our service workers are having to sleep in their cars, live in hotels and motels to deliver the most magical experiences for visitors while generating tax revenue for the state. And yet they will never be able to experience that magic themselves. So this is a serious issue that I'm passionate about. Also, because I grew up working class here in Orlando. My dad worked at Disney part-time. My mom worked at Kmart. So for me, the families that I serve every day in the legislature and the constituents that I help when it comes to housing issues, it hits a point where the system as it currently stands is just not working. And we can't give in to special interest on this. We have to do what is not only reflective of other municipalities and states across the country, but what's going to allow us to have the most flexibility to help lift up every Floridian.
Let's talk about the education budget for a little while. As you know, the legislature has, on several opportunities, and not in the last few years, made up for shortfalls in that budget by raising local property taxes. Now that there's approximately $4 billion a year flowing out of the education budget into vouchers, the public education budget, what should the state do to make sure that that burden is fairly shared and that schools have the ability to provide free, high quality public education as required by the Constitution?
Well, I voted against universal vouchers because I don't think it's good policy. We should not be siphoning away public dollars to for-profit private schools, especially those that are unregulated, have no accreditation. The quality of that education is not going to be measurable. And even if it was, the results would not be positive. You have many situations of families that take a voucher opportunity and then have to go back to public education because they realize that the quality was not what they expected. And even right now with the voucher system, to be very candid, I have families contacting my office because they can't get reimbursed. And they're facing delays with both the AAA program and Step Up for Students. And these are also families that have children with disabilities who are not getting through, not getting reimbursed, facing debt and financial stress because of the state's inability to even process a program that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle championed. So this is a serious problem across the board, because not only do we have teachers that have left the field in droves because they're underpaid and overworked and have to deal with the politicization of public education, but of course, even when it comes to the private market and the allocation of those public dollars, not only is it hurting public education's financial stability, but then at the same time, these are families who can't even get the reimbursement that is rightfully theirs under law. So with that said, we need to ensure that the FEFP, the formula is actually reflecting where the need is today. Right now, Orange County is facing an impasse between teachers union and the school district. And this is due to conversations on teacher pay alongside other types of health benefits and needs that our educators have in order to have one job versus have to work multiple jobs to teach our kids. So we have to pick up our fair share, allocate dollars from the general revenue to education to make sure that we are fulfilling our state constitutional responsibility of every child having access to good public education. And a part of that just means not prioritizing privatization, but prioritizing strong public education.
Well,
Chris, were you going to follow up?
follow up. Yeah. Actually, I think we covered everything on that one, but
Okay.
I did want to ask a question about property insurance, which is the subject that is very much on all of our minds. I suspect that we're about to find out that many of the people who lost everything and Hurricane Helene were without coverage because they simply cannot afford it. For the resident to pay more and get rent on their property insurance. And lawmakers have been dragged back to Tallahassee time and time and time again to fix it, but there has been no fix that benefited consumers. What would be your prescription to get this back on track?
Well, first of all, I want to echo the points that you just made around the impact of the latest hurricane on all parts of Florida, but of course also into Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Our legislative office is actually hosting a supply drive right now for the Big Bend, and many of those families and individuals impacted don't have property insurance, and their path to restoration is going to be very difficult. But even those who have insurance, as we've seen with Hurricane Ian in Southwest Florida 2 years later, are still not getting paid out for their claims. And 60 Minutes recently did an expose highlighting how insurance companies changed the recommendations by public adjusters to underpay their customers. And that leads, of course, to lawsuits and long fights where families to this day are still not able to live in their homes after Hurricane Ian. So this is a crisis, and we have to hold insurance companies accountable, not continuously craft legislation that benefits their interests. So first and foremost, we need a true public nonprofit insurance company that's open to all Floridians. This already has models in California and Texas, and would be the most transformative change that we could make in addressing the property insurance crisis. Florida is one big peninsula just sticking out into the Atlantic Ocean. We're in Hurricane Alley. We're going to continue to see these disastrous storms, especially as there's no action on climate change in our state, and of course, not enough around the world. And so we really have to invest in a true public nonprofit option, which is bipartisan legislation that Representative Hillary Cassell and Representative Spencer Roach filed last year that I co-sponsored. And we will be filing it again alongside our colleagues because this really is the change that we need. But I also think we have to continue to push for accountability on private insurance companies. Unfortunately, many, again, have fancy accounting and systems where they can avoid paying what is owed to their customers. And we continue to prioritize their private profits and not the needs of our constituents. And so we really have to ensure that there's also transparency when it comes to the private market and that we are stopping these excessive payouts to CEOs to ensure that we have payouts to consumers.
So the governor's office was revealed to be working directly with the Department of Environmental Protection to build hotels, golf courses, pickleball, and disc golf courses with little public notice and study as to the environmental damage they could cause. Only the public's outcry made them backtrack. Did you oppose this? And what legislation would you suggest to ensure that doesn't happen again?
Absolutely. I oppose this wholeheartedly, and I'm proud to work alongside so many amazing organizations from the Florida Springs Council to Environmental Defense Fund in pushing back against these efforts to pave over our state parks and to push on just responsible water usage. I recently joined the Florida Springs Council for an FDP and Water Management Board meeting on following the law when it comes to restricting water consumption permits. But to the heart of your question, we have made a public records request of FDP asking for receipts, asking for the legislation that was cited, if any, that led to this covert effort to destroy many of our state parks. So as we wait for those records to present themselves, I think basic policy changes would be ensuring that any type of effort to pursue large-scale development in our state parks requires public commentary and public town halls, time-certain requirements that are dramatically extended to ensure that something like this can't be sneaked through are some basic changes that we can make to protect our state parks for generations to come.
So you're a leader on Amendment 4, which is meant to protect reproductive rights, including abortion access for Florida women. If it passes, do you anticipate further attacks on reproductive freedom from the legislature?
I do. So for those who don't know, before I ran for office, I worked at Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida. Like so many American women, my Planned Parenthood story started as a patient. Because my mom passed away when I was a kid, I didn't have access to any type of information about consent or reproductive health. And so I walked into a Planned Parenthood Health Center when I was 18 years old, and I left with a method of contraception that was right for me. So these issues are not only personal in the sense that I am a reproductive age, I am a woman, and I may need these healthcare services. But of course, when I think about just our fundamental freedoms for women and families across the state of Florida, it is so foundational that we vote yes to Amendment 4 and restore these freedoms back to where Florida was prior to the 6 and 15-week abortion ban. Now, with that said, I feel confident that there will be legislative switches in the sense that some seats will flip to Democrat this cycle. But I don't think it will be enough to actually change the makeup of the legislature so that Democrats are in control. So realistically speaking, going back into Tallahassee with Amendment 4 reaching 60%, there will be another layer of fights, not only in the interpretation of Amendment 4, which, as we've already seen, Republicans are trying to mislead and confuse voters with incorrect fiscal impact statements, with publicly funded commercials and ads out of state agencies. But I would suspect that there will be efforts to ignore the will of the voters and not fully implement Amendment 4. So having a legislature and having voices like mine in Tallahassee becomes even more important, as we need to fight to ensure that the voters' voices on both Amendment 4 and 3 are fully realized, and that the legislature doesn't create roadblocks and other efforts to evade the Constitution when it comes to respecting personal medical decisions. And I'll close with this point that regardless of where folks' personal viewpoints are on abortion, we know that overwhelmingly Americans and Floridians agree that these decisions about one's pregnancy should be made between that person, her family, her doctor, her faith, and not politicians. And so that value that is shared across the state of Florida needs to be respected in the legislature. And so though I expect fights, we are prepared for it.
Thank you. You in that last answer, you did touch on Amendment 3, and you're on record as supporting that, which would legalize marijuana for personal use. Can you sum up for us why you're supporting it?
Of course. I'm actually not a user of cannabis, and I also don't drink often. So my support Amendment 3 is not necessarily personal for me, but I do feel like we have seen across the country efforts to repair the war on drugs, to repair harm committed in this effort of criminalizing cannabis, where predominantly low income and communities of color, areas of concentrated disadvantage, have faced large statistics of incarceration compared to their peers. And so I do support Amendment 3, not just because I don't see a reason for it to be criminalized, especially with the science information we know now, but I also want to see the tax revenue that will be generated from it. I want to see a path to expungement for those who've served time with cannabis charges. I want to see a reform of the criminal justice system as it pertains to these charges. And I also trust adults to make these decisions when it comes to cannabis usage. Now, there are very, very important criticisms on the current system of cannabis production and cannabis purchasing in Florida, where we have a vertical integration And it doesn't allow, especially for smaller businesses, entrepreneurs, minority-owned businesses, to be able to engage in the market. So the legislature has the opportunity, and I would argue the responsibility, to also open up this system to be a free market, to actually allow different actors to participate and benefit from what is absolutely going to be a financial gain for companies who are some of the largest contributors to the initiative. And so it is up to us to also help make that system more flexible and more accessible to others. And of course, I'll be fighting for that in the legislature.
Thank you for that.
Thank you,
Wanted to
Sam.
ask one more question about affordable housing, if I could.
Yes.
Which obviously is a major issue for us. The Live Local Act, which was passed, the largest legislation meant to address the issue. Is it adequate?
Absolutely not. I mean, Live Local Act not only preempted Orange County voters on rent stabilization initiative that we fought hard for and that voters overwhelmingly approved, but it's insufficient, not only in its funding, but in its programming. It prioritizes housing that's mainly focused between those of 80% to 120% of the area median income, which of course has value, but it totally ignores people who are making 79% or less of the AMI. And for us here in Central Florida, that's a lot of our service workers. The Hometown Heroes program, of course, has been expanded, and I think that program is very impactful, but it's still out of reach for a lot of the families that I work with every single day. I have families who are just $300 short of making rent. There's a grandma with her granddaughter that I just assisted by paying out of my own pocket to help her because she needed $300 to get into her apartment. And of course, she needed support with moving trucks and so forth. There are all of these very real needs in our community that Live Local Act does nothing to address. And of course, many local governments have been opting out of Live Local because of the impact to their revenue, which of course is important. They can't pay for police or fire. They don't have tax revenue themselves. And then other local governments have expressed concern because the program really incentivizes housing to be built in more sprawl areas versus infill. And so I would recommend that we have to continue to combat NIMBYism, the not in my backyard mentality, because that's a real issue when it comes to building affordable housing. We also need to see more programs around zoning and parking limits and incentivize infill. There are so many empty lots across Orlando, across Orange County, that are already in developed areas that need to be revitalized. And what an opportunity to work with local governments and with the state of Florida to ensure that we are building in our communities, not sprawl and spreading people out away from their places of work. Because many of these families also cannot afford car insurance. They don't have the ability to own a vehicle. So we have to get really creative here. But part of the concern is that the Local Act is insufficient and doesn't incentivize the type of development we actually really need.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are past the time that we promised you we'd be done, but there is one question that I think we really need to ask you in particular, because this is how you first really changed the statewide notice. You've mentioned several times things that your office has done to help constituents. What kind of systemic change in the legislature could encourage more representatives and senators to do this kind of outreach on behalf of their constituents? Some of them are already doing the best they can. Some of them are not. But what would be your recipe for bolstering lawmakers' ability to help their constituents?
That's a really great question. And I know some are doing their best, but I also know others are not, because unfortunately their constituents end up calling my office. And so our team is small but mighty, and we carry a caseload of not only District 42, but also of cases from other parts of the state because the need is so great. So I do think that part of it is that we need voters to know that the status quo is not what you have to accept. You don't have to settle for it. I feel like some of our work in the legislature, especially when it comes to constituent services, is redefining public service and helping to show everyday Floridians that you should have a lawmaker who's responsive to you. You should have a lawmaker that prioritizes your personal success and goes out of their way to help you, whether it's with property insurance or small business issues or with rent or disability services. You should have a lawmaker that's engaged at that level. So I do think that we're helping to change that culture shift, because I often have folks who come to me and say, oh, I moved out of your district. I live in this area now. I never see my rep. And my response is, well, you should reach out to them. You should contact their office and ask, hey, can you help me with this? And where are you, right? And create that accountability. So I do think there's a role that citizens play in this. But from the lawmaker perspective, there definitely can be more education in the legislature. I think some lawmakers just assume that that is the job of staff and not their job. So I think in the legislature, we can do a better job of educating, especially freshmen who come in, of what their responsibility is and how it's not just working during session, but it's also providing support to constituents. The pushback you're always going to get is just the time commitment. I mean, this is known as a part-time job. It's paid as a part-time job, but obviously it's not. And I do know that's a barrier to some lawmakers being able to have more engagement with their constituents. But at the end of the day, we need to realize that Florida has grown substantially in the last even decade, and serving 188,000 constituents requires a full-time responsibility and arguably more staff, as our offices are only equipped with 2 team members. And if you have additional dollars in your budget, you can hire a part-time staffer, which is what I do. But of course, it's a very difficult, even for 2.5 staffers, to manage the caseload that we have.
Thank you so much. And there is so much else that we could ask you, keep you all day. But I wanted to get you've got many other things to do, I'm sure. But before we go to your closing statement, I just wanted to remind viewers that the Sentinel will be making a recommendation in this race. But we don't expect you to just go by our recommendation. There's so much more information out there. Both candidates, we assume, will be making appearances at local forums. Both of them have websites, and we will give you Mr. Pohl's website, just so that you know it's gregpohl.com if you want to take a look at his record and his recommendations for Florida. And then, of course, I believe your website is annaforflorida.com, right there behind your head. So please take a look at all the information out there, including the Sentinel's excellent news coverage, and then decide who best fits your values as residents of District 42. Most importantly, make sure you are registered. Time is running out if it hasn't expired already. To get registered, I believe Monday is the last day. And then, of course, you have to remember to vote on or before November 5th. So with that, Representative Eskamani, would you please tell our readers why they should send you back to Tallahassee for your final term in the House?
Well, again, thank you so much to the Orlando Sentinel Editorial Board for having me. And I'm really honored to be in this place of service. You know, our slogan at Team Anna is working for you, fighting for us. We also believe in building bridges whenever we can, while not being shy to hold individuals or corporations accountable when we must. And that's the approach that we lead with in the legislature every day and in our communities as well. Now, my opponent likes to spread misinformation about our effectiveness, and I do think our track record speaks for itself. But I want to stress that, of course, in the legislature, you can't get things done without being bipartisan, which is why I'm really proud to have passed a permanent tax break on children's diapers and adult incontinence products, putting money back into the hands of our constituency, saving Floridians upwards of $100 million a year. And in that same token, we brought money back to our district, upwards of $1.35 million for Lock Haven Chain of Lakes for water restoration projects, $1 million for homelessness services networks, youth outreach program, alongside $75,000 for Mother's Milk Bank of Central Florida, and so many other nonprofits that do work that each one of us care about, alongside supporting local infrastructure like a Winter Park fire station and other needs that our community has. The reason why I am committed to service is because I grew up in this community as a daughter of working class immigrants. I went to Orange County Public Schools, K to 12. I went to UCF, where I carry now 5 degrees, including a PhD in public administration that I just completed in August. And of course, I work in the nonprofit sector to this day. I see the potential that our community has as someone who is helping to reach those aspirations, to address affordability, to protect our freedoms, to ensure that our kids can read what they want to read and learn about the world. And I know Florida has the potential to shine in all these avenues, whether it's from housing affordability and solving the property insurance crisis to being more energy resilient and really owning the title of the Sunshine State. But you need to have representatives who prioritize these issues, who are not going to fall into culture war battles and are going to focus on delivering for their constituents and getting the job done. And so I humbly ask for your support for my final term in the state legislature. And I thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you for spending the time with us, and thank you for sharing your story and sharing your views.